I chose a topic "It's harder than it looks, gambling reform in Australia" for two reasons. Firstly, despite the overwhelming evidence and community support for gambling reform in Australia, powerful vested interests, in conjunction with compromised and conflicted state governments, have sought to thwart change at every step. Secondly, gambling reform is harder than it looks because a key reform, the solution itself, is relatively simple and inexpensive to implement. For a few years now, I've been quoting from British Labor Party firebrand and stalwart Tony Benn, is in his 80s now, to explain my response to the way politicians from the major parties have viewed my position on gambling reform. Tony Benn said, "It's the same each time with progress. First they ignore you, then they say you're mad, then dangerous, then there's a pause, and then you can't find anyone who disagrees with you." Well, I've been ignored and I've been called both mad and dangerous, often by the same people and at the same time. But it seems that in Australia we may finally be heading towards a pause before everyone agrees. The question is, how long will the pause last? Although sometimes I think that borrowing from ancient Greek mythology might be more appropriate for those of us involved in gambling reform. Like Sisyphus, it seems that we are destined eternally to keep pushing a boulder up a hill, only to have it roll back to the bottom every time we get near the crest. Even though Prime Minister Gillard broke the pioneering agreement on gambling reform that she struck with Tasmanian Independent MP Andrew Wilkie, gambling reform is now irrevocably on the federal agenda. Gambling losses in Australia now outpace those in New Zealand by more than 2 to 1 on a per capita basis. Australians are the world's #1 gamblers in terms of gambling losses per capita by a massive margin. I think the only country that's closer to us, according to the Economist recent index, was Singapore, but a lot of that is non-Singaporean gambling because they're two huge casinos. So in terms of domestic gambling, we outpace everywhere else in the world. Gambling losses have gone from over $7 billion to $19 billion in the course of a couple of decades, with poker machines devouring $13 billion of that. The #1 jackpot junkies in Australia are the state governments, who reap over $5 billion in gambling taxes per year. So in their conflicted role both as tax collector and regulator, we really do have Dracula minding the blood bank. Whilst one dodgy pub doesn't make an unsafe industry, an unsafe product does. And that's why I decided to run in the 1997 South Australian state election on an unambiguous no pokies platform. I did want to make a point, and the point really was that poker machine policy is a litmus test of good government, whether a government values its citizens over its easy but predatory tax dollars. The tipping point, in part, was the release of the landmark Productivity Commission report into gambling in Australia, released in 1999. The Productivity Commission is a fearlessly independent statutory body. It's a think tank. It's funded by the government, and it's been criticised for its dry, economically rational view of the world on a range of issues. However, the Commission, when it came to gambling, delved into the social and economic costs of gambling. This report, which relies on the largest survey on gambling ever undertaken in Australia, set the benchmark for evidence-based evaluation of problem gambling. For the first time, there was more than just anecdotal evidence on the harm caused by the liberalisation of gambling and the lack of adequate regulation. Interestingly, we do have a situation where problem gambling rates in Western Australia, because they don't have poker machines there, are dramatically lower than any other part of the country, particularly severe problem gambling. Now, what the Productivity Commission found in that landmark report, that there were something like 250,000 adults in Australia were estimated to have experienced significant harms from gambling in the last 12 months. This is about 10 years ago. For each of these problem gamblers, on average, another 7 people were affected: families, family members, friends, employers. Problem gamblers accounted for about 1/3 of gambling expenditure in Australia back then, or $3.6 billion, with over 40% of poker machine losses, 42.3% to be precise, coming from problem gamblers. And those problem gamblers were more likely to gamble on poker machines than any other form. The report also emphasised the importance of empirical data and independent research and regulation. It also raised issues that are almost assumed knowledge today, that poker machine addiction leads to higher crime levels and suicide, that the access and intensity of machines makes them more addictive than other forms of gambling, that lives are torn apart across the country every day because of gambling addiction. The report was a pretty uncomfortable one for state governments, but it was largely ignored because regulation for gambling was done at a state level, and it was assumed that the Commonwealth couldn't intervene. And I did introduce some legislation to deal with the whole issue of poker machine reform. The Productivity Commission put out a draft report. It said that in terms of reforms, a key reform would be to have $1 maximum bets per spin. On poker machines, it's $2.50, as Graham pointed out to me, in New Zealand, with a maximum loss of $120 an hour, because at the moment you can lose quite easily $1,200 an hour or more on poker machines, but the average rate of loss, if you're playing them at their maximum intensity, is $1,200 an hour. Productivity Commission said reduce it from $10 to $1, reduce the volatility of machines with a smaller jackpot, and we've done the work on this on the Joint Select Committee on Gambling Reform that I'm a member of, and you can get to an average loss, or to aim for a maximum loss of $120 an hour. Make the machine much safer. The Commission, in both the draft and final reports, made the point that 88% of recreational gamblers on poker machines don't bet more than $1 per spin. So here was a practical reform that simply would not affect people, recreational gamblers, and over 80% of gamblers overall, and I'm not sure what the figures are in New Zealand, but the Productivity Commission found that something like only 30% of the population ever actually play poker machines. The Commission also recommended that $1 bets should be implemented without a trial, and that it needed to be done by 2016. Nearly said sixth the wrong way, sorry. Mandatory pre-commitment was also recommended so that those using poker machines could decide how much money they could bear to lose and how much time they wanted to spend, and that was seen as an ancillary recommendation. The Commission also reported that not much had changed since 1999 in relation to the regulatory framework, and in fact Gary Banks, the chairman of the Productivity Commission, who I think is a very straight shooter in the sense that he won't play favourites with anyone, and I think he's very rigorous in the way he does his job and impartial. He has set out in a number of papers since the 1999 report, continuously saying that the states aren't doing the right thing in terms of regulation. Issues such as independent research haven't been addressed. It said that while state governments have changed their regulatory processes in the last 10 years, the changes were not effective, and that was the Productivity Commission's view. It was also clear that recommendations made over a decade earlier about the independence of gambling research and advocacy had not been addressed, and that's an issue where I think that New Zealand and Australia must, and in fact researchers around the world at this conference must work on unambiguously, unequivocally to deal with, because that is a real problem. If you want to have good evidence-based reforms, then you need to sort out this question of independence of research. And linked to that, there must also be, consistent with the Productivity Commission's recommendations, greater independence of researchers and a requirement that funding sources be fully transparent and disclosed. I think we are entitled to know, in such a crucial area of public policy, who pays for the researchers, where does the funding come from, has there been any link between the researchers and the source of funding or any third parties? They are essential and fundamental questions that go to the very credibility of that research.